and welcome. It's been a while since we recorded one of these. Our guest for today's interview, with number 18, is Ignacio Gonzalez, Principal Fire and Life Safety Engineer at Parsons. Ignacio has extensive experience working in the Middle East, and today we'll get to know him better, and hopefully, we're going to learn from his career path. I'm going to start with the usual question. How did you get into fire engineering, Ignacio?
Um, Thank you first of all for having me here and inviting me for this interview. Um, okay, all my professional career has been related to fire, although not to fire engineering. So the way I started with fire, I mean, many people get involved in fire engineering or in fire because they have relatives who work in the fire industry, or they are firefighters, or they're fire engineers. And my case is not that one. I have just for the opposite side of the spectrum. I never had anything to do with fire until I came, by chance with this opportunity to work in fire. So when I graduated from college, I got my major was in chemical engineering, and my hopes back then, I'm talking about almost 30 years ago, was to get to work in the chemical industry. So that was my hope when I finished. Unfortunately, the unemployment conditions and the situation back then in Spain when I graduated didn't allow me to do that. So what I did was applying for an internship, and when they called me, I didn't know exactly what I was expecting or what they were going to offer me. So I went to this first interview like in a blind date. I knew the name of the company, I knew a place, and I had to meet there. And back in the time, I mean, I'm talking about almost 29 years ago, because it was around this time of the year in 1993. And I went there without knowing exactly what was this about. So I went to this interview, and I went there and I didn't know anything about what was the position about. And they started to talk about I met with the three owners of the company, and they said, "Oh, yes, we call you because we requested someone with your profile, a graduate in chemistry or engineering, and this is for a training of an opportunity in a training center, and training what? And they said it's training of fire. You just to be a firefighting instructor," and it was just blew my mind. I said, "What? I mean, I've never, in my studies, I've never studied anything related to fire." And not only that, I mean, I studied chemical engineering to avoid giving any training. So my idea was to work in an industry. They say, "Okay, fine." So here we are. And so I was in a tough position, and because that was not my dream work. So, but on the other hand, I was unemployed. I was eager to start working because I was 6 months unemployed. So I said, "Okay, I'll take it." And I started to work in this job. I think it was in January '94. And it was really tough at the beginning. It was a daunting experience because it was a typical thing that you are not expecting to do. Not only that, is that you said that I'm not going to do that. And at the end, you had to do it. So I think the first 3 months were like quite challenging. But the good news is that I came out of that daunting experience for me back then, reinforced. I mean, with the idea that I can do this, and I ended up enjoying that job. So after 6 months, and I got positive feedback. I mean, that challenge, it was transformed into a success, a personal success, and that was great. But after a few years working, this is what typically happens, right? You have a challenge, you overcome that challenge, and all of a sudden you reach a plateau. And in that plateau, I was, too much comfortable. I said, "Look, I'm not going anywhere, just doing this. I mean, this is not fulfilling enough for me. So I was kind of stuck in that type of in that time of my life, and I mean, incidentally, some guest instructors who came to our training center mentioned these fire engineering studies in the States. So I said, well, it sounds like an interesting, opportunity for me. Maybe this is what I'm actually looking for, because I was always interested in learning. I mean, I was that like 30 years ago, and I'm the same today. I always like learning. So I said, look, this is maybe a good opportunity for me. So I started to do some research. So this was around 97 or so. So it was like 3 years into my training in firefighting instructor career. And and I started to do some research, and I found some schools, some interesting schools in the States. But the problem is was funding, too much expensive. But I don't know. Somehow I found a way to manage to get into one of those studies. So in 2000, it was like a dream come true. So I was able to go to the States and study there. And I started to study fire engineering. It was in the summer of 2000. Almost 6 years after I started my work at the training center. And I had the opportunity to study in one of the best schools in the States. Back in the day, there were two main schools. One was the Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and the other was the University of Maryland. And I have to choose between the two of them. I chose at the end Worcester Polytechnic Institute because I thought it was more hands-on. University of Maryland looked more academic, and I was more like a practical, pragmatic consultant, applied guy. So I said, okay, I'm going for WPI. So I spent there like 18 months, and it was a great experience from a training standpoint. And the good thing is that I was hired by a fire consultancy firm, and I started to work for them in January or February 2002. And that's how everything started, and it continues until today, so 20 years later. So that's how I got into the fire engineering business, and I'm
Well,
very happy that it happened that way.
indeed. And as Miruna mentioned at the start of this interview, you have over 10 years experience working in the Middle East. But before that, you also work, as you mentioned, in the United States and a bit in Spain. So actually, how challenging is it to work in the Middle East?
I will say that it depends. Okay, the Middle East, there are many differences depending on the country in the Middle East. My experience is mainly in the Gulf country. Okay, so it's very different if you talk about Middle East, you can talk from Egypt to Lebanon to Jordan, I mean, or Syria, but the Gulf area is slightly different, and even within the Gulf area, there are differences across countries. From my experience, so everything I'm going to say is related to the Gulf area, and because, as I said, the location is very different. If you go to work to Egypt, it's not the same as working in the UAE. I currently work in the UAE, okay? But the thing is that in the UAE, 85% of the population is expats. So basically, you are dealing very sparsely with locals here. So in my current job, yes, I work with them, but it's just incidental. But typically, you deal with people who are not from this country. This is the first thing. While if you work, like, for instance, in Egypt or in Lebanon, you will be working more with local people. So the experience is very different. Okay, this is the first thing, and the other thing is that it depends on your mentality. So if you are a person who likes to travel and to work abroad, it's not going to be a problem to come to a place like the UAE. Okay, it depends on the personalities and it depends on your age, because it's not the same a young person who is familiar with the internet, like and you know what to expect because there are lots of videos and there are lots of information about your country, so you can get informed before coming here, and you won't experience what we used to experience in the past, which was like a cultural shock, right? Because the amount of information was very limited. You had to go to, your library or so, getting a book and see how is life in the Middle East. And by the time you read the book, probably the book was outdated. But today is very different. So I work with people who had this cultural shock, even as in nowadays, okay? They came from the States and they were expecting that people will behave here like in the States. I say, look, this is not supposed to happen like that, right? Because you're dealing every day with people from India, from Pakistan, from Canada, from New Zealand. It's just a melting pot. And you're not supposed to expect people to behave the way they behave at home. Of course, this happens with people of certain age, but with young people, I've never experienced that. I mean, all my experience with young engineers is that they love to be here, especially in the UAE. I work also in Qatar, in Doha, and for them it's a great experience because you have the opportunity to interact with people from many parts of the world, and it's just a very enriching experience. I mean, not from a professional standpoint, but also from a personal standpoint. It's just great. So I will say to answer the question of how challenging it is to work in the Middle East, it depends on your mentality. But nowadays, for young graduates, I will say that working in the Gulf countries, especially the UAE, Qatar, less so in Saudi and Kuwait. Maybe Bahrain is something similar to Qatar and UAE, but I think it's a great experience if you like to travel. Of course, if you like to stay in your country and go on Sundays to your football matches of your team and all that, this is not for you. But if you like to meet other people, other countries, other cultures, it's just a fantastic opportunity.
Well, that's great to hear. Also, I was going to ask you, what is the main difference between the fire codes you use in the Gulf area compared with those in the United States, for example?
Okay, I can talk about the Gulf countries, and what I can say about the Gulf countries is that there is the U.S. Has a strong influence in these countries. Okay, and especially, I mean, based on my experience, NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association, and the codes are vastly applied in these countries, with some exceptions. And the exceptions typically are related, interestingly, with the historic heritage of each country. Like, for instance, the UAE was in the past a former colony of UK. So you can see the influence of the United Kingdom in the codes of the country, because just to give you an example, the electrical codes are based on British electrical codes, but the electrical code in the States comes from NFPA. So, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, which they don't have this influence because the strong influence is from the Americans, the electrical code is American. So here it's just a matter of reconciling codes that are in, I will say, like 80 or 90% American, with certain codes that are important that come from other countries. So it's a matter of reconciling both, and sometimes they don't match very well. So in those cases, you need to have a deep understanding of the background to be able to reconcile them, especially in this country. Qatar has a slightly different history, okay? But I would say that most of the codes that apply here are NFPA-based codes, so very similar to the codes in the US. Now, I need to include a caveat here, and it's related to the fact that most of the designs here are prescriptive based, not performance based. Okay, so our prescriptive based means that it's the strict application of the letter of the code, with some exceptions, because here there are many designs that are iconic and do not fit into the letter of the code. In those cases, you apply performance based. But the problem with dealing with the authorities is that they are quite wary about this type of innovations, because for them it's much safer to interpret what the code says from the letter of the code and they prefer not to delve into this type of performance-based design. But I mean, the type of projects that you have here lead towards this type of application, the performance-based design. So I would say that it's similar to what is going on in the States. There's the same codes as applicable in the States. And for some iconic projects, you need to use performance-based design. But basically, it's the same thing.
Well, I am convinced all this knowledge and experience have created lots of exciting and innovative projects. So, Ignacio, tell us about some captivating projects you've done.
Most of the iconic projects I work on were in this region, and I'm trying to think. I mean, recently I worked in a couple of interesting projects. Well, in 2017, I started to work in the line extension of the metro, the Dubai Metro, to the Expo 2020. That due to the pandemic, it was delayed until 2021. And that was a great experience because, I mean, when you're working as one of these iconic projects, you have the opportunity to work with great architects. And, you know, this type of infrastructure, they have many different components. And it's very interesting. You deal with many different types of facets in the same project. But I think that from a combination of iconic and different types of projects within the same project, I will say that my most iconic project was the Hamad International Airport, which is these days in the news because it's in Qatar, right? So we have the World Cup, the Football World Cup in Qatar these days, and that airport has been the gateway for all the national teams. And I would say that was one of my most iconic projects because it's not just the terminal building, which is what anyone, like, you know, if you fly to Doha today, you will find the terminal building is what everyone sees. So a terminal building in a country is something that goes beyond the building itself. It's just the image of the country. Remember that first impressions is what it counts. So the first impression that you get of a country is when you arrive to that country. So this terminal building and the airport itself, it's like a work of art. Okay, Hamad International Airport has been for 2 years in a row, and it's the best airport in the world in Skytrax. Okay, and has been, you know, outscoring the previous one, which was Changi, I think, Changi Airport from Singapore. And that gives you an idea of how the level of luxury and the design that this airport has. But it's not, the good thing about working in an airport is not just the design itself, because I joined this project late. It was in 2011, and it was just for the acceptance testing of the fire systems. But it's all the stuff that goes into an airport because it's like a small city. So there you have like a catering facility in which they prepare the food for the flights, and they prepare multiple types of food. They have facilities that are designed to fix the movement equipment that they use there, like the cars that you see moving the hand. So they have the workshops for that. They have, of course, the hangars. They have one of the largest hangars in the world. And they even have stables for animals. So because they transfer camels and all these, that was quite interesting because one of the anecdotes there was in these stables, because when we were trying to commission the system, someone came up with the idea, said, yeah, but you know, because technically you're supposed to paint the sprinkler system with the piping with a red color, and someone came up with the idea, said, yeah, but we cannot paint it in red because the camels get scared of red. I said, what? We need to go to civil defense and ask for a dispensation of this one. I don't know if this was a myth, But someone came up with the idea. Okay, great. So we might need to go to, civil defense, which is the approval of the authority having jurisdiction approving the project, and ask for a dispensation because of the cameras. It was quite funny. I don't know if it ever happened, but yeah, it was. So what I'm saying is that there are many facets in a project, although you only see one thing, which is the terminal building, but there are many facilities around it that is like a small city. Very interesting project.
This is truly a great project that you worked on, and also very complex. But now I'd like to go back to when you started your career as a fire engineer, and what's something that was more challenging than you expected to be?
I think, and this is not just for fire engineering, I think it applies everything in life. Everything is challenging when you don't expect it, right? The problem when you are dealing with something that is new, like it happened in my first interview, is uncertainty, right? You go to a place and you don't know what to expect, and that creates some type of, the uncertainty creates fear. It's just a natural reaction, right? So I would say that the most challenging part in fire engineering was dealing with people, interpersonal skills, because that's stuff you don't learn it in the school, right? I mean, nowadays you get more exposure, and I say this because of my children, because in the school they get more, they are forced to interact with people. In my generation, it was not that way. So I felt that when I started to work after finishing my master's in fire engineering, that I was strong on the hardcore skills, math, physics, all the stuff that you learn basically in the school, but not in the personal skills. So I could say that my most challenging part was dealing with people. And I'm remembering my interview with the CEO of the company that hired me in the States. And it was funny because we were explaining, he was asking me what subjects I took during my master's. And, I was kind of apologetic, saying that, look, I had to take this course here in the summer because there was no other course available. And this was a course in negotiations, right? So the problem is that I wanted to finish everything, and only the summer courses of negotiations were available, or courses, not related to fire. And he said, you know what? This is one of the best courses you can take, because you need to deal with people. I mean, when you interact with numbers, the numbers do not respond to you. But negotiations, you use that every day. It's one of the best courses you could take. So I was kind of relieved. And the other thing is that, dealing with people is, I guess, was the most challenging part. The good news is that based on my first experience dealing with training with people, helped me a lot to soften that blow of dealing on a daily basis with people, because when you interact in training, you get to know a little bit of interpersonal skills. When you're in a class, with experience, you get to know how people react, and you expect, based on body language or in tone. I mean, it was not a shocking experience, but it helped me a lot. That first experience in the training business, to overcome this, challenge of dealing with people when I was a consultant. So that's basically dealing with people. I would say that that's the most challenging part.
I also imagine that at the beginning of your career, you start to do some research about the field or fields, because, as you said, you expect the unexpected, and inevitably, unforeseen things will appear. So, what do you wish your younger self knew about your current profession?
Dealing with uncertainty, maybe. Yeah, in hindsight now, I mean, after, a trajectory of 30 years, if I could go back and mentor myself, because this is what I'm doing today. Today I'm mentoring. And I'm just giving advice the same way I would advise myself 30 years ago. So basically, what I would do, 30 years back with the knowledge I have today. This is the case.
Yeah.
And what I will say is that um, I'm just thinking now that, for instance, I don't know if you heard the quote from Steve Jobs that you cannot connect the dots looking into the future or looking forward. You can only connect them when you look back. So you need to trust yourself when you get to that level of uncertainty that everything is going to work fine for you. So just be patient with what life brings to you and trust life, because if you have the right mindset and you have a good will, everything will work your way. I cannot explain why, but it works like that. Okay, it worked for me. When I put myself, through the challenge. My first job, I came out quite successful, and I noticed that when you are persistent in trying to achieve something, at the end, I mean, it pays off somehow. I don't know how it works, but it works like that. So my advice will be patient and don't be discouraged by what life is throwing at you. I'm just remembering another quote, but I don't remember. I think it's from Tony Robbins. Life uh, happens for you, not happens to you. Okay, so there is a reason behind everything that happens in life. So just be patient and stick to your goals, and you will be successful at the end. That was what I would advise to myself if I could go back into the past.
Thank you for sharing this with us. And this is something we'd like to ask our guests almost every time because we really enjoy getting the most out of it. So, what advice would you give to a graduate on their way of becoming a successful fire engineer?
Um, the advice I will give will be related to, I think it's related to what I mentioned before. It's trying to, I think I can give many advices, to be honest with you. But I mean, but instead of giving an advice, I'm going to give you a meta advice, which is I'm going to tell you to get someone who can give you all this advice. Get a mentor or get a coach. This is the best thing I can recommend. Because I can give you one advice and it will serve you well. But if you get one person who can give you all the advice, it will be much better. So my recommendation is get a good mentor. And the other thing I will say is that if you cannot reach a mentor, if you're going to be hired by a fire engineering firm or any company that you're going to, this applies to any company, so it's not for fire engineering. Try to get a company in which they foster your growth and your uh, try to support you from a professional standpoint. It's not a company that they will give you a task, they park you in a corner, and you will see only your supervisor during your annual reviews. It's someone who can support you continuously. This is like, I usually use the analogy of a good career with a strong body, right? When you finish your studies, it's like having like a strong skeleton, bones that can support a lot of load. Because when you finish your studies, it's like, okay, your university, you're ready for the market, but you're ready up to a point. And then the next step is that you need to build experience. And the experience is like the muscle that you build around those strong bones that you have created when you were studying, right? And the only way to do that is having a good company that can mentor you and can guide you and can coach you throughout your career. So that would be my best advice. So getting a good mentor, and if possible, if you see that you are in a company that is not supporting you and your growth as a professional, that will make a huge difference, not only in 1 or 2 years in time, but probably 10 years into your future, because it's setting the foundation of who you're going to be in your, in your senior part of the career. This is what I would recommend. Just getting a mentor for a company that can foster your growth as a fire engineer.
I think that's actually a great advice. And now we reach the end of the interview. That was our last question for you. So thank you for accepting our invitation and answering all of our questions in great detail.
My pleasure.
And just to conclude, guys, even though every beginning is uncertain, tough, and requires a lot of constant learning, you'll discover great experience on your way. When you look back, you'll realize that was all worth it. And you just need to be patient and get a good mentor, as Ignacio said, who will grow and support you continuously.